Peter Haskins had been saving his pay for 4 years without knowing who he was saving it for, and the morning Clara Bishop stepped off the stage in Redemption Creek, he understood with a clarity that struck him like lightning across an open plain that the waiting was finally, irrevocably over. The summer of 1878 was the kind that baked the red earth of southeastern Colorado into something resembling fired pottery, and Redemption Creek sat in the middle of it all like a rough jewel half buried in dust. The town had grown from nothing into something over the past decade, pulled along by cattle drives and the railroad surveys that kept promising to arrive and kept not arriving, sustained instead by the stubborn optimism of the people who had decided to plant themselves there and refused to leave. There was a general store run by a man named Holt who weighed every transaction with the suspicion of a former revenue agent. There was a saloon called the Dusty Rose that served whiskey watered just enough to keep men alive but not sober. There was a livery stable, a jail that sat half-empty most months and terribly full during others, a church whose congregation prayed earnestly every Sunday and got into magnificent trouble the rest of the week, and a post office that also served as the telegraph office and the barber shop, which made for some unusual conversations. Peter Haskins was 31 years old and had been working cattle for the Caldwell Ranch since he was 23. Hired on by old Franklin Caldwell himself during a spring roundup that had gone 3 weeks long and tested every man to his limit. Peter had outlasted the others not because he was the biggest or the loudest, but because he was the most quietly relentless person Franklin Caldwell had ever seen, and the old rancher had told him so the morning he offered him a permanent position. Peter had been riding for the Caldwell outfit ever since, working his way up from day hand to trail boss, becoming the kind of man the other hands came to when a storm broke wrong or a river crossing went sideways, and Franklin Caldwell paid him accordingly. The saving had started almost by accident. In the spring of 1874, Peter had been in the Dusty Rose on a Saturday evening when a traveling merchant had been telling the story of a man back in Kansas City who had lost everything he owned because he had spent every dollar he earned the moment it landed in his hands. Peter had nursed his single glass of beer and listened to that story with something shifting quietly inside him, and the next payday he had taken half his wages to Holt's general store and asked if Holt kept a lockbox. Holt did. Peter had deposited the money and walked out into the afternoon sun feeling something he could not name, something that sat between purpose and anticipation, and he had been doing the same thing every payday since. His bunkmates teased him about it with the good-natured cruelty that cowboys reserved for the things they secretly envied. Tom Briggs said Peter was saving up to buy himself a county. Young Davy Alcott said he must be planning to disappear to California. Amos Wade, who was the oldest hand on the Caldwell place and had been everywhere worth going to, said nothing about it for 3 years, and then one evening in the bunkhouse said quietly that a man who saves without knowing why is a man who knows something about himself that he hasn't put words to yet, and left it at that. Peter had thought about those words more than he would ever admit. By the summer of 1878, the lockbox at Holt's store held $412, which was a sum of money that could buy a small parcel of land, build a modest house on it, and furnish it with everything a family needed to begin a life together. Peter had not consciously constructed that calculation. He had not sat down with a pencil and paper and worked toward a specific goal. The money had simply accumulated the way intentions do when they are sincere, and it sat in Holt's lockbox waiting with the patient certainty of something that knows its moment will come. The stage from Pueblo arrived in Redemption Creek every Tuesday and Friday at roughly 2 in the afternoon, weather and road conditions being the kind of variables that made the word roughly necessary. On the first Friday of August 1878, Peter was in town to pick up a supply order for the Caldwell Ranch. his wagon loaded with empty crates waiting to be filled with flour, salt, lamp oil, and the other necessities of a working ranch. He had finished his business at the general store earlier than expected, and was standing beside his wagon with a cup of coffee from the small eating house across the street, watching the stage roll in through the curtain of dust that announced it from half a mile away, simply because there was nothing else to watch, and a man at rest deserves something to look at. The stage rocked to a stop in front of the relay station, and the driver, a leather-skinned man named Curly Hatch who had been driving this route for 6 years, climbed down from his box with the stiffness of someone who had been sitting in the same position on a road that was actively trying to destroy him. He pulled the door open, and the passengers began to emerge. A drummer in a city suit whose face had gone green, a family of 4 with the look of people who had committed to a destination and were no longer sure why, and then Clara Bishop. She stepped down from the stage with a carpetbag in one hand and a hatbox in the other, and she stood for a moment in the white August heat and looked at Redemption Creek with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that suggested she was measuring it against something she had imagined and finding the comparison complicated. She was 24 years old, though Peter did not know that yet. She had dark hair pinned up under a traveling hat that had survived the journey better than most of the passengers. She had brown eyes that caught the afternoon light and held it, and a quality of composure that looked less like calm and more like someone who had learned to be steady in the middle of difficulty, and had been practicing long enough that it had become genuine. She wore a gray dress that was travel-dusty but well-made, and she looked at the main street of Redemption Creek, the way a person looks at a problem they are prepared to solve. Peter Haskins watched all of this from across the street over the rim of his coffee cup and felt the 4 years of accumulated savings shift in his chest like water finding a new level. He was not a man given to romantic flights of imagination. He had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in eastern Kansas, the middle son of a family that valued work over sentiment and practicality over poetry. He had come west at 17, knocked around through several territories doing whatever work presented itself, and ended up in Colorado because the land suited something in his temperament that he had never found a proper way to describe. He had known a few women in a few towns over the years, nothing that had gone deep enough to leave a mark he could trace later. He had watched men marry in haste and build lives on foundations that looked solid until the first real pressure revealed the cracks, and he had taken note without deciding that marriage itself was the problem. He had simply been waiting, though he would not have used that word to himself, and now standing in the street in August of 1878 with a cup of coffee in his hand, he understood for the first time with startling specificity what he had been waiting for. He did not walk across the street immediately. That was not who he was. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the seat of his wagon and made sure the supply boxes in the bed were settled properly. And while he did these things, he watched from the corner of his eye as Clara Bishop spoke to Curly Hatch, who pointed her toward a building down the street. Peter recognized the direction. She was being pointed toward the hotel, which was a 2-story affair run by a widow named Margaret Hale who kept it clean and charged fair rates, and had very specific rules about noise after 9 in the evening. Clara Bishop picked up her carpetbag and her hatbox and walked in the direction Curly had indicated with the purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere to be, and Peter found himself walking in the same direction at a respectable distance that maintained every appearance of coincidence. What saved him from feeling foolish about it was that the general store, where he still had a second order to collect, was also in that direction. He arrived at Holt's store at the same moment Clara Bishop paused outside it, looking at the sign above the door with the slight frown of someone checking an address against a mental list. She looked up when the door opened and Peter held it, having arrived at precisely the right moment to do so with something that felt like grace. "Thank you," she said, Her voice was low and even, with a quality that suggested it could carry across a noisy room without being raised. "Welcome to Redemption Creek," Peter said, and then immediately felt the inadequacy of those words because the town was not particularly welcoming in its immediate appearance, being dusty and loud and somewhat rough around every edge. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile but the intention of one. "Is it a creek of redemption?" "There's a creek," he said. "The redemption part is still under discussion." That did it. The smile arrived fully, and it changed her face in the way that a sunrise changes a landscape, not by adding something but by revealing what was already there waiting for the light. "Clara Bishop," she said, and shifted the carpetbag to her left hand and offered her right. "Peter Haskins." He shook it, and her grip was firm without being performative. "Are you passing through or staying?" "Staying," she said with the certainty of someone who has already made a decision she does not intend to revisit. "I've taken a position as the new school teacher." Peter had known that Redemption Creek was expecting a teacher. The previous one, a young man from Ohio named Prescott, had lasted 8 months before deciding that the frontier was not compatible with his constitution, and had departed in March with a letter of apology to the town council and a look of profound relief. The council had advertised in 3 newspapers and received several replies, and had ultimately offered the position to someone responding from Denver, someone who had presented credentials that satisfied the school committee and references that checked out when the council chairman wrote to verify them. He had not imagined the teacher would look like Clara Bishop. He had not imagined her at all, which was perhaps what made the reality of her so forceful. "The school is on Birch Street," he said, 2 blocks north. "It's not much to look at from the outside, but it's sound." "I appreciate you saying that," she said, with a quality of amusement that suggested she was already prepared for the reality to be more complicated. "I should get settled. Mr. Holt is holding a package for me." She went inside, and Peter followed, collected his second supply order from a Holt who was looking at Clara Bishop with the calculating attention of a man trying to determine what category she fit into, paid for it, carried it to his wagon, loaded it, stood for a moment looking at the horses, and made a decision. He had $412 in a lockbox and no plan for any of it, and for the first time in 4 years he felt the beginning of one. He drove back to the Caldwell Ranch that afternoon through the baking August heat with his supply boxes rattling in the wagon bed, and he was so quiet during the unloading that Tom Briggs asked if somebody had died. Peter said nobody had died and went to put the horses up, and in the cool shadow of the livery he thought about Clara Bishop's grip when she shook his hand, the way she looked at the town with those assessing eyes, and the smile that had arrived like something earned rather than given freely. And he thought that if a man could plan to deserve a thing, he would spend the rest of his life planning to deserve exactly that. The next 3 weeks proceeded in the careful, deliberate way that Peter Haskins approached most things, which was to say with attention and patience, and no wasted motion. He found reasons to be in town more frequently than his duties strictly required, which Tom Briggs noted with a knowing grin that Peter chose not to acknowledge. He learned Clara Bishop's patterns. She arrived at the school early and left late. She ate her noon meal at the eating house called Margie's that was run by a large-hearted woman named Marguerite Flores, who had been feeding Redemption Creek for 12 years. And she spent her Saturday afternoons at the town library, which was one room in the back of the church, and contained 300 books that the congregation had donated over the years with varying degrees of enthusiasm about reading. He managed to be at Margie's for the noon meal on 2 Tuesdays running, which resulted in conversations that lasted longer than either of them planned, and he walked her to the school on the second occasion because the afternoon was threatening rain, and she had left her umbrella inside, and they stood under the overhang of the schoolhouse door while the rain came down for 20 minutes and talked about Kansas, where it turned out she had also spent a portion of her life. her family having homesteaded in the eastern part of the state before circumstances had brought her west. He did not ask about the circumstances. Not yet. He could hear in the way she spoke around the subject that it was something she was not ready to unfold for a man she had known for 2 weeks, and he respected that the way he respected fence lines and property rights, not as barriers but as indications of where care was required. What he did ask was what had brought her to teaching, and she considered the question with the seriousness it deserved before answering. "My mother taught me to read," she said, "before I had any formal schooling. She sat with me every evening and we went through every book she owned, which wasn't many, but she made them feel like a library. I think I became a teacher because I wanted to do for someone else what she did for me." "That's a good reason," Peter said. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you to cattle work?" He thought about it honestly before answering, which was the only way he knew how to approach anything. "I was good at it from the beginning and it was honest work," he said. "And this country suits me, the open of it. I need to be able to see far." She looked out at the rain falling on the red dust of the street and converting it to mud. "I understand that," she said quietly, though he had the sense she was speaking of a different kind of far, and he did not push. The rain stopped and she said goodbye and went inside the school, and Peter stood for a moment in the smell of wet earth that was the best smell in the world on dry land, and felt something building in him, with the steady certainty of a structure being raised one timber at a time. It was Amos Wade who finally said something useful about it. Amos was 63 and had been married once and widowed, and had never remarried, and he carried his history with the quiet dignity of a man who had processed his grief and reached an accommodation with it. He and Peter were on a night watch together in the 3rd week of August, a still and star-crammed night on the range when the cattle were settled and there was nothing to do but keep them company and talk or not talk as the mood required. "You've been in town a fair amount lately," Amos said, not accusingly, just observationally, the way he said most things. "Supply runs," Peter said. Amos was quiet for a while. "Heard there's a new schoolteacher." "There is." Another silence, the comfortable kind that old men and content animals share with each other. "What's she like?" Peter looked at the stars over the dark mesa to the west. "Steady," he said finally. "Smart. She has a way of looking at things, really looking at them, that makes you feel like whatever you're saying is worth the consideration." He paused. "She smiles like she means it." Amos said nothing for a long time. Then, "That's a good accounting of a person." "I know. You going to do something about it?" "I'm trying to figure out the right pace," Peter said. "I don't want to be a fool about it." "Son," said Amos, with the authority of a man who had watched a great many fools and non-fools in his time, "there's fast foolish and there's slow foolish, and neither one is better than the other. The question is whether you're being cautious because it's the right thing or because you're scared." Peter did not answer right away. The cattle shifted and settled in the darkness below them. "Maybe some of both," he said. "That's honest," Amos said. "The scared part's all right. The scared part means it matters." Peter thought about $412 in a lockbox in a town where the redemption part was still under discussion, and decided that Amos Wade was probably the wisest person he had ever sat a horse with. He asked Clara Bishop to supper the following Saturday. He caught her coming out of the library in the late afternoon, and he had spent more time than he would admit preparing what to say, and in the moment he forgot all of it and simply said, "I'd be honored if you'd have supper with me this evening, Miss Bishop, at Margie's if that suits you." She looked at him for a moment with those assessing eyes, and he met them steadily, because he was not a man who looked away from things that mattered. Then she said, "I would like that, Mr. Haskins," and the directness of it, no coyness, no performance, just a clear and honest answer, was so exactly what he would have wanted from her that he had to work to keep the relief from showing too obviously on his face. They had supper at Margie's and talked for 2 hours while Marguerite Flores refreshed their coffee with the knowing serenity of a woman who has seen this particular progression many times and is fond of it. They talked about books. because Clara had a great many opinions about books and expressed them with precision. They talked about the land, because Peter had spent 15 years learning to read it, and it was one of the subjects he knew most deeply. They talked about the school, which Clara was reorganizing with the systematic energy of someone who had identified a problem and was committed to solving it properly. The previous teacher had left the materials in a state of significant disorder, and Clara was rebuilding the curriculum from the ground up. 23 students, she said, ages 6 through 14, every one of them with a different starting point and a different pace. The challenge is giving each of them what they need without losing any of them. Sounds like running a trail drive, Peter said. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, warm and immediate, and it did something to the evening air around them. I hadn't thought of it that way, though I imagine the students are somewhat less likely to bolt during a thunderstorm. Don't count on it, Peter said, and she laughed again, and he thought he could listen to that sound for the rest of his life without it diminishing in the smallest degree. Walking her back to the hotel afterward in the warm August night, the stars overhead and the town quieting around them, there was a moment on the boardwalk outside the hotel door when neither of them moved immediately to end the evening, and the air between them had a quality of charge to it that Peter recognized as the beginning of something that, once begun, would not go back to what it was before. "Thank you for a very pleasant evening," Clara said. "Thank you for agreeing to it," Peter said. He wanted to say something more and couldn't find the form for it, so he said, "I hope you'll allow me to repeat it sometime." "I hope you'll ask," she said, and went inside, and Peter walked back to his horse at the livery with the distinct sensation of a man who has been given a map to a place he very much wants to go. September arrived, and with it the opening of the school year, and Clara Bishop became, in a matter of weeks, one of the most talked-about people in Redemption Creek, which was a town that talked about things with great commitment and variable accuracy. What the talking was about, most of it, was the quality of the teaching, because children who had previously regarded school as a location to be occupied were now coming home with an urgency about books and numbers that their parents found variously delightful and baffling. Mrs. Caldwell, Franklin's wife, told Peter at a Sunday gathering that her youngest, who was 9 and had previously showed no interest in anything academic, had announced at the supper table that he intended to read every book in the library, and Mrs. Caldwell attributed this development directly to Miss Bishop. Peter listened to these accounts with the quiet pride of a man who knows something about a person that others are only beginning to discover. He and Clara had supper together twice in September, and the conversations went deeper each time, revealing more of the geography of each other's inner lives. On the second occasion, she told him more about Kansas, about the farm her family had worked for 8 years before a series of failed harvests, and a bank that proved less patient than the weather had forced them off it, about her father's death 2 years after that loss from a fever that might have been treatable if there had been money for a proper doctor, about the way she and her mother had managed in the years following, taking in sewing and washing, and whatever work was available, about how she had gone to the normal school in Denver on a scholarship earned by examination, about the years of teaching in Denver's less prosperous districts, and then the decision to come further west. Because the need was greater and because, she said carefully, a new place felt like the right thing. A new start, Peter offered. A continuation, she corrected gently. I don't believe in leaving things behind. I believe in carrying them forward differently. He thought about that for a long time after they said good night. He thought about it the next morning on the range, the cattle moving in the cool September air, the mesa golden with the turning of the season, and he thought that he had never heard a person articulate something he believed in without having words for it, and that finding such a person was not an ordinary occurrence in the life of any man. He took his hat off in the October wind and looked at the land he had been riding for 8 years and thought about what he wanted. He wanted land. He had known that for a while. The Caldwell Ranch was Franklin Caldwell's and would pass to Franklin's son when the time came, and Peter had no stake in it beyond his labor and his wages, which were good and honestly paid, but which were not his. He had never resented this because he had understood it from the beginning, but he felt it differently now, the distinction between working a man's land and standing on your own. He wanted a house that was his. He wanted a kitchen with a window that looked out over ground he owned, and a place to sit in the evenings, and something worth coming home to at the end of a day's work. He wanted Clara Bishop, though he had not yet found the way to tell her so in full. He went to see Holt about the money in October. Holt was a careful man with numbers and had kept the lockbox with the precision of someone who took the responsibility seriously. The total, with the interest Holt had applied at the rate they had agreed upon, was $437. Thinking of spending it, Holt asked. Thinking of investing it, Peter said. He had heard about a parcel of land 6 miles from town that a homesteader named Grover had abandoned the previous spring, unable to make the debt work after 3 difficult seasons. The land was 30 acres. Flat ground mostly with a creek along the south edge that ran year-round, and there was a structure on it that had been a barn and could be something else with sufficient work. He had ridden out to look at it in September without telling anyone, tied his horse at the fence and walked every foot of it, testing the soil with his boot, reading the grass and the water and the lay of the ground the way he read the range. And he had come away knowing it was good land that had been managed by someone without the skill or luck to do it justice. He went to the land office and found out who held the debt on the Grover parcel, which was a holding company out of Denver, and wrote a letter requesting terms for purchase. The reply came in 3 weeks, $280 cash, and the title would transfer. Peter replied immediately accepting the terms. He closed on the Grover land on the 15th of October, 1878. He stood in the thin autumn sunshine, holding a piece of paper that said the 30 acres were his, and felt something settle in him so profoundly that he had to close his eyes for a moment against the emotion of it. He had $157 remaining, and land, and a ruined barn, and a plan that was beginning to take a shape he could describe. He told Clara about the land 3 days later, on a Thursday evening when he happened to be in town, and found her walking back from the school in the long golden light of an October afternoon. He fell into step beside her and described what he had purchased and why, and she listened with the full attention she gave to everything, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment before saying, "That sounds like exactly the right kind of investment." "I hope so," he said. "I've got plans for it." "What kind of plans?" He looked at her in the afternoon light and thought about the months between August and October, about supper conversations and the rain under the schoolhouse eaves and Amos Wade on a night watch and 4 years of money in a lockbox. He thought about whether the pace had been right, whether he had given her enough time to know him and herself enough to know what she thought of what she was seeing. "I'd like to tell you about them," he said carefully, "if you'd let me." She stopped walking and turned to face him, and the brown eyes with the afternoon light in them were steady and clear and waiting. "I'm listening," she said. "I want to build a house on that land," he said. "A real house, not a temporary thing. Something with a kitchen and a parlor and room enough for a life. I want to run cattle on it, not many to start, but enough to build something over time. I want it to be a place worth coming home to." He paused. "I've been saving my pay for 4 years, and I couldn't have told you exactly why until August when you stepped off the stage. And I know that's a strange thing to say to a person you've known for 2 months, and I'm not asking anything of you yet. But I want you to know where I'm standing, because I think you deserve honesty about where a person stands." Clara Bishop looked at him for what felt like a very long moment but was probably 5 seconds, and in that moment Peter Haskins held himself very still, the way he held still in the moments before things were decided. "That is honest," she said. "I respect it. I'm not trying to rush anything," he said. "I just didn't want to go on without saying it." She started walking again slowly, and he fell into step beside her. "Peter," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else. "I came to Redemption Creek because I needed a new chapter. Not because I was running from something, but because I was ready to run towards something. I didn't know what. I've been paying attention to what's here." She glanced at him with a quality of expression that made his chest do something complicated. "I've been paying particular attention to certain things." He let out a breath he had been holding for approximately 2 months. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed, and the walk back to the hotel was one of the best experiences of his adult life. Just the golden October light and the quiet town around them, and Clara Bishop's arm a half-inch from his as they walked. Close enough to feel the warmth of but not yet touching. A distance that felt like the very best kind of anticipation. They were walking out together formally by November, which in Redemption Creek was acknowledged with the speed and thoroughness of a telegraph transmission. Marguerite Flores declared she had known it from the second Tuesday, when she had refilled their coffee 3 times. Holt said nothing, but calculated the trajectory with the satisfaction of a man whose projections had proven accurate. Margaret Hale at the hotel told Clara that Mr. Haskins was well regarded, and that she had made no complaints about him as a man, which from Margaret Hale was something close to a glowing endorsement. Franklin Caldwell called Peter into his office the first week of November, which Peter entered with the slight apprehension of a man who doesn't know if the news is good or bad, and found the old rancher looking at him with the assessing eyes of someone who has made a decision and wants to communicate it properly. "Word is you bought the Grover land," Franklin said. "I did," Peter said. "Good land," Franklin said. "Wasted on Grover, but good land." He shuffled some papers on his desk in the way of a man who is organizing his thoughts. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to take it the way it's meant, which is as respect and not condescension. You've been my best trail boss for 4 years. I'd hate to lose you." "I'm not going anywhere right now," Peter said. "No, but you're going somewhere eventually," Franklin said, which was not a criticism but an acknowledgement. "I can see the shape of it, so I want to make you a proposition." He leaned forward. "You keep working for me through the spring drive. In return, I'll give you 8 head of breeding stock from my herd, your choice of animals, as a parting gift from a rancher who has valued your service. That'll give you something to start with on your 30 acres. Peter stared at him. 8 head of good breeding stock from the Caldwell herd was a gift of extraordinary generosity, worth more in the long run than the land itself. "Franklin," he said. "Don't make it sentimental," the old rancher said, which was his way of saying he was already feeling it and preferred not to dwell there. "Thank you," Peter said, and meant it in the way that very few things in a life are truly meant. He told Clara about it that Sunday after church, on a walk they had taken to become a habit, down the road toward the creek and back, an hour each week that had become something he looked forward to the way other men looked forward to Saturday nights. She stopped walking when he told her about Franklin's offer and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to name but had something of wonder in it and something of resolution. "You have land," she said, "and soon you'll have cattle." "Not much of either," he said, "but enough to begin with. Peter." She said his name and stopped, and he stopped, and they stood in the November wind with the bare cottonwoods rattling around them. "Tell me again what you want to build on that land." He looked at her directly because he was done being anything less than clear about it. "I want to build a life on it," he said. "A home, a family when the time is right. I want to sit on a porch in the evenings and know that the ground in front of me and the house behind me are mine and whoever shares them with me, and I want to be the kind of man who deserves that." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to let me court you properly with all of that in mind. I'm not asking for an answer to anything else today." Clara Bishop looked at him in the November wind and the bare cottonwoods and the thin Colorado sunlight for a long moment, and then she said, "I think you've been the kind of man who deserves that for longer than you know." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him. her fingers interlacing with his with a naturalness that felt less like a beginning and more like a recognition. And they walked back toward town in the November wind, and the world felt remarkably, precisely right. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was the project season. Because Peter began work on the Grover land the moment the trail work slowed enough to give him time. And work on a piece of raw land in Colorado in November is a serious undertaking that demands more than simple intention. He had the barn structure to work with, which was solidly built if not elegant, and he spent the first month reinforcing it and converting one end into a habitable space while he planned the house. He drew plans in the evenings in his bunk by lamplight, not architectural drawings in any formal sense, but the practical diagrams of a man who has looked at many buildings and knows what makes one work, measuring rooms against his arm span, thinking about where light would fall and where wind would come from, and where a kitchen should be relative to a garden. Tom Briggs came out to help on 2 Sundays in November with no explanation beyond showing up with tools, and Davy Alcott came once, and 3 men from the town, including a carpenter named Silas Prout, who built things for money, but also for the satisfaction of building them well, came on a December Saturday when the weather held clear, and they framed the exterior walls of the main house in a single day. Clara came with Margaret Hale and Marguerite Flores on a January Sunday to see the progress, and she walked through the framed rooms in her winter coat with her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she looked at the space where the kitchen would be, and said, "This window should be bigger," with the authority of someone who has already been imagining the view through it, and Peter laughed and said he would make it bigger. And Margaret Hale looked at Marguerite Flores with the expression of women who have been right about something for a long time and are pleased to have it confirmed. The conversations between Peter and Clara deepened through the winter in the way that conversations do between people who are genuinely trying to know each other, not presenting their best arrangements, but offering the actual texture of their inner lives. He told her about his father, a hard man who had not been cruel but who had been so rigidly practical that there had been very little room in the house Peter grew up in for things like beauty or joy or tenderness, and how he had spent a long time as a young man doing things that were purely practical before learning, somewhere out on the range with only the stars and the cattle for company, that a man could value the practical and still find room for more. She told him about her mother's death 2 years before, the quiet passing of a woman who had been the axis of Clara's world, and the months of grief afterward that had finally resolved into a determination to carry forward what her mother had given her rather than mourn what was gone. "She would have liked you," Clara said once, on an evening walk in February, the snow thin on the ground and the stars brilliant overhead. "She valued honest men." "I hope to prove it worth being valued," Peter said. "You already have," Clara said simply, and he felt the truth of it settle into him and stay. He proposed in March, 2 weeks before the spring trail drive that would be his last as a Caldwell hand. They were at the house, which by March had a roof and 3 of 4 walls properly closed in, and he was showing her the kitchen with the large window, which Silas Prout had built exactly as she had specified. She was standing in the space where the kitchen table would eventually be, looking out the large window at the land, the creek visible at the south edge of the property catching the evening light, and Peter stood behind her and thought that this was the moment, that there would not be a better one, and that looking for a better one was just another form of the fear that Amos Wade had named back in August. "Clara," he said, and she turned, and he was already reaching into his coat pocket for the ring he had carried there for 2 weeks, a small and simple thing he had purchased from a jeweler in Pueblo on a trip he had taken specifically for the purpose, not elaborate but well-made and honest, which seemed like the right qualities. "I love you," he said. "I want to live my life on this land with you. I want to sit at that kitchen table and talk to you every morning, and I want to build things with you and argue about window sizes, and I want to raise children with you and grow old with you. I know we're in the middle of a conversation that started 8 months ago, and I know I'm asking you to step into a life that isn't finished being built yet, but I think that's actually the right time to ask, because I want us to build it together. He went down on one knee on the unfinished floor. Will you marry me? Clara Bishop looked at him on one knee on the bare pine planks of their half-finished kitchen, with the evening light coming through the large window she had asked for, and her eyes went bright with something that was not sorrow, and she said, "Yes, Peter, I will marry you." He stood up and put the ring on her finger, and she held her hand up to the light and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her completely, because she stepped forward and let him hold her. And he held her with the care of a man who understands that the thing he is holding is the most important thing in his life, and intends to treat it accordingly. "The window really needed to be bigger," she said into his shoulder. "You were entirely right," he said. She laughed, and he held her in the empty kitchen of their half-finished house on their 30 acres in the March Colorado light, and felt something in him that had been waiting for a very long time expand to fill a space it had been saving itself for. The spring trail drive went hard but well. Peter led 3,000 head of cattle across 300 miles of variable terrain with the professional competence of a man doing for the last time, a thing he had done many times before, and there was a quality of attention in his execution of it that his hands noticed and commented on among themselves, the particular sharpness of a man who is finishing something in order to begin something else. They were back in Redemption Creek by mid-May, and Franklin Caldwell was true to his word. 8 head of breeding stock, 4 cows and 4 heifers, selected from the best of the Caldwell line, were delivered to Peter's 30 acres on a Tuesday morning while Peter stood by the fence and watched them walk onto his land and felt the full weight of what the word, his, meant. He went to find Clara in the afternoon to tell her the cattle had arrived, and found her at the schoolyard in the warm May afternoon, sitting on the steps watching the children run in the last light before the school day finished. And she saw his face and read it accurately before he said a word. "They're there," she said. "They're there," he confirmed. She stood up and brushed the dust from her dress and said, "Come find me when you're ready to finish the house." He was back from the cattle delivery by Friday, and he and Silas Prout worked through the last 2 weeks of May to close in the house completely, finishing the walls and the roof, installing the door and the windows, and beginning the interior work that would make it habitable. Amos Wade showed up on the first Saturday of June with a rocking chair he had made himself, a beautiful piece of work for a man who claimed woodworking was just something he did with spare time, and set it on the unfinished porch without ceremony or explanation, and Peter said thank you, and Amos said the thanks was for the years, and that was enough. They were married the 14th of June, 1879, in the church in Redemption Creek, by the Reverend James Howell, who had been ministering to this congregation for 11 years, and who performed the ceremony with the combination of solemnity and genuine warmth that distinguished the best of those occasions from the merely official. The church was full. Marguerite Flores had organized the flowers, which were wildflowers from the Colorado summer in abundance. Margaret Hale sat in the front row on the bride's side. Franklin Caldwell and his wife sat together with the dignity of people who understand they are witnessing something that will matter. Tom Briggs and Davy Alcott sat together in the middle rows and behaved themselves admirably. Amos Wade sat in the back and watched with the expression of a man who has seen many things in his long life and is grateful to have been present for this one. Clara walked down the aisle in a dress she had made herself over the winter months, ivory-colored with a high neckline and sleeves that ended at the wrist, simple and well-made, and exactly right for a woman who values honesty in all its forms. She carried a bundle of wildflowers. She looked at Peter when she walked through the doors and kept looking at him the whole length of the aisle, and he looked back with the steadiness he brought to everything that mattered. And when she reached him and Reverend Howell asked who gave this woman in marriage. There was a moment of silence, and Clara said clearly, "I give myself," because there was no one remaining to do it for her, and it was one of the most quietly courageous things Peter had ever heard anyone say. And he loved her for it with a force that rearranged the geography of his chest. The vows they spoke were the standard words of the ceremony, but they said them as though the words were being coined fresh, with a seriousness and intention that made the church very quiet. When Reverend Howell said Peter could kiss his bride, Peter took Clara's face gently in his hands and kissed her with the care and certainty of a man who means every syllable of every promise he has just made. And the congregation responded in the way that genuine moments always provoke, with a release of feeling that had been building. The reception was at Margie's, which Marguerite had closed to the public for the afternoon, and decorated with more wildflowers, and there was food enough for twice the guests and music provided by a fiddle player named Cal Denton, who had learned to play in Tennessee and had never lost the warmth of it despite 30 years of Western life. Tom Briggs danced with every woman who would dance with him. Davy Alcott drank more than was wise and made a speech that was heartfelt if not entirely coherent. Franklin Caldwell gave a toast that was brief and dignified, and contained more feeling than its brevity suggested. Amos Wade did not dance but clapped for those who did, which was his form of participation. Peter danced with Clara and discovered that she was a natural dancer, having learned from her mother, and they moved together with the ease of two people who have already learned to share space with consideration. And at one point in the middle of a slow fiddle tune, she put her head on his shoulder, and he held her, and they simply moved together in the June evening with the whole long future open ahead of them, and everything settled and right. They moved into the house on the 30 acres the following week, taking Clara's things from the hotel and Peter's from the bunkhouse, and combining them in the rooms they had built together. And the kitchen with the large window caught the morning light exactly as Peter had imagined it would, and Clara stood at the window on the first morning drinking coffee, and looked out at their land and the creek at the south edge and the Colorado sky above it, and said, "This is a good place, Peter." "It will be," he said, and joined her at the window, and they looked out together at everything they had and everything they were going to do with it. The first real test of the marriage came in late summer, as it does for most couples, not from any failure between them but from the world pressing in. In July, there had been some tension in the region between homesteaders and a large cattle operation to the north of Redemption Creek, run by a man named Denton Bray, who had been in the territory longer than most, and who operated with the territorial certainty of a man who considers the existing legal framework an inconvenience rather than a constraint. Bray's cattle had been ranging across several homesteaders' fences, and two of the homesteaders had lost stock that they believed had been absorbed into Bray's herds without permission. Peter had encountered Denton Bray before, professionally, and had always maintained the professional courtesy that cattle work required between men who occupied the same geography without being friends, but he had no illusions about what Bray was. He was a man who had always operated as though scale conferred rights, and in a territory where the law was thin and the distances were long, that attitude had gone mostly unchallenged. The challenge came in August when Bray's riders pushed a large herd across the south end of Peter's property, across the creek, which not only violated the fence line but mudded the creek significantly and damaged a section of the bank that Peter had been reinforcing to protect the year-round water supply. Peter rode to town and filed a complaint with the county sheriff, a measured man named Edgar Colt, who had the thankless job of maintaining law in a county where distances made response times approximate, and where the relative power of the parties involved was always a factor in what was practically achievable. Colt listened to the complaint carefully and said he would speak to Bray's outfit, and his face had the expression of a man who knows what the conversation will sound like and is not looking forward to it. Clara, when Peter came home that evening and told her what had happened, listened to the whole account and then said, "What do you need?" "Witnesses," Peter said. "I know the fence line violation happened, but I need someone who was there." 3 of the Mullen homestead children saw it happen, Clara said, and Peter looked at her in surprise and she explained. 2 of the Mullen children were her students, and the family had mentioned the cattle coming through during a school conversation that week, the older Mullen child having described seeing riders push the herd across the property lines deliberately. This was how Clara Bishop became, in her quiet way, the decisive factor in a legal complaint against Denton Bray. She spoke to the Mullen family carefully and respectfully, treating their testimony as the serious matter it was, and the Mullen parents agreed to make a formal statement to Sheriff Colt. 2 other families along the South Range came forward with similar accounts once they heard the Mullens had spoken, and by September Sheriff Colt had assembled a case that was substantial enough to take to the district court. Denton Bray paid a significant fine and was ordered to keep his cattle off neighboring properties with a specificity that made the legal boundary real in a way it had not been before. It was not a complete victory in any grand sense, because Denton Bray was still a large and powerful presence in the county, and the injustice of the way land and power distributed themselves in the territory was not solved by one legal proceeding, but it was something real. It was a line drawn and held, and it established that Peter Haskins and the property he had built were not available to be pushed across, and that mattered, and the other small landholders in the region registered it with relief. That evening, with the legal matter settled and the fence line repaired, Peter sat on the porch in the rocking chair Amos Wade had made, and Clara sat in the chair beside it that they had bought in town, and the evening spread out before them in the Colorado August with the stars beginning above the mesa, and Peter said, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything but tell you what I heard," Clara said. "You heard it because those children trust you," he said. "That's not nothing. That's everything." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, and they sat in the warm evening and watched the stars come out one by one over their 30 acres, and Peter felt the deep, satisfying weight of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. The first winter in the house was the best winter of Peter Haskins's life, and he thought about this frequently with the slight amazement of a man who spent 30 years building towards something without knowing its dimensions, and then found that the reality exceeded the imagination. The house was warm, better insulated than he had originally planned because Sela's Prout had been particular about it, and Peter had trusted his judgment. And the kitchen with the large window caught the winter light in the afternoons and filled the room with a quality of gold that made even February feel hospitable. Clara had her teacher's work to carry her through the cold months, and she brought it home with her in the best sense, talking over the students and their progress at the kitchen table while Peter listened and asked questions that were genuine because he had come to know the students through her accounts of them, had developed opinions and assessments of 23 young people he knew mostly by name and reputation rather than face. She had the gift of making her professional world vivid and alive in conversation, and it spilled over into the evenings in a way that made the house feel full even when it was just the 2 of them. In early December, Clara told him she was expecting a child. He was sitting at the kitchen table when she told him, coming in from the cold with her cheeks red from the walk from town, and she told him with the same directness she brought to everything, without ceremony or preamble, standing in the kitchen in her winter coat and looking at him with the particular expression of a woman who is delivering news of enormous consequence and wants to see how the person she loves receives it. Peter Haskins received it by standing up so quickly his chair nearly tipped backward, and crossing the kitchen in 2 steps, and taking her face in his hands the way he had in the church, and saying her name, and she laughed at the expression on his face, which was apparently something worth laughing at. And he kissed her and she kissed him back, and outside the snow was beginning to fall on their 30 acres, and the creek at the south edge was quieted by ice, and the cattle were in the barn, and the world was extraordinarily, specifically right. The baby came in July 1880, a boy they named Franklin James Haskins, the Franklin for the rancher who had given them the start of their herd, the James for the reverend who had married them, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning in the heat of the Colorado summer while Clara labored with the competent help of Margaret Hale, who had delivered half the babies in Redemption Creek over the years. And Peter waited on the porch in the July heat with the helpless intensity of a man who wants to be useful and has been firmly and correctly removed from the situation by people who know what they are doing. When Margaret Hale opened the door and said, "Come in, Mr. Haskins," and Peter walked into the bedroom and saw Clara holding a red-faced, indignant, brand-new person, the feelings that moved through him were beyond what he had equipment to process, and he stood in the doorway for a moment just receiving them before he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and at his wife and felt something that had no word in any language he knew, but that was undeniably the right response to the occasion. "Franklin James Haskins," Clara said, looking at the baby with the particular expression of a woman who has just done something extraordinary and is beginning to take stock of the results. "He looks very serious." "He's considering his options," Peter said. Clara laughed, and the baby looked startled by the laugh and more indignant than before, and Peter put his finger in the baby's palm and felt the small hand grip it with the mechanical strength of new life, and thought that if this was what 4 years of saving and 8 months of courtship, and all the rest of it added up to, then he had been building towards something so much larger than he knew that the building had been an act of faith without his fully realizing it. Franklin Haskins grew, as babies do, with a speed that seemed impossible to the parents who were watching it happen. He was a serious child with his mother's assessing eyes and his father's quality of stillness, and he watched the world with an attention that Clara declared would make him either a very good scholar or a very good cattleman, and possibly both. He was walking by October and talking by the following spring, and his vocabulary was a source of enormous entertainment to both parents, because he acquired words with the thoroughness of someone collecting necessary tools, using each new one precisely once he had determined its exact function. Amos Wade visited the Haskins place in the spring of 1881 and held Franklin with the careful tenderness of a large man handling something precious, and looked at the child's serious face and said to Peter, "This one's going to know what he thinks about things." "He already does," Peter said. Amos looked around at the house and the land and the cattle grazing at the edge of the south pasture, and then at Clara moving in the kitchen through the window, and then at Peter beside him on the porch. "You did all right," he said, which was the Amos Wade equivalent of a standing ovation. "I had time to prepare," Peter said, and Amos laughed, which was a rare and wonderful sound. By the summer of 1881, the Haskins cattle operation had grown from 8 head to 22, which was still modest, but was growing at a rate that Peter's careful management made sustainable. He had hired one hand, a young man of 19 named Cabe Torres, whose family had been in the region for 2 generations, who worked with the natural instinct of someone whose relationship to cattle was something inherited rather than learned. Cabe was quiet and capable, and Peter trusted his judgment with animals, which was the most important judgment in the work. Clara's school had grown as well. The student population had reached 31 by the fall of 1881, with new families continuing to arrive in the region, and the school board had agreed to her proposal for an expanded curriculum that included not just reading and arithmetic but basic geography and history and science of the observational kind that could be conducted with the materials available in southeastern Colorado. She was, by any measure, exactly what the town needed her to be, and she knew it and was glad of it without being vain about it. There were hard things, as there are in every real life. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was brutal, one of the coldest on record in the territory, and they lost 2 head of cattle to conditions that no management could have fully prevented. And there were 3 weeks in January when the house felt very small, and the cold very large, and patience was tested to its edge. One evening in that January, Peter came in from the barn after 3 hours in the killing cold, dealing with a sick animal, and was so tired and cold and discouraged that he sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands and said nothing for a long moment. Clara put a mug of hot coffee in front of him and sat down across from him and didn't say anything either, just was there. And after a while he lifted his head and looked at her in the lamplight and felt the fatigue ease slightly just from the quality of her presence and said, "Thank you." "You didn't need me to say anything," she said. "I needed you to be here," he said. "That's more than enough." And she looked at him across the kitchen table in the January lamplight with the winter raging outside. And what passed between them in that look was one of those moments that constitutes the actual substance of a life together, the kind of moment that cannot be manufactured and is worth more than its circumstances suggest. The cattle they lost were replaced in the spring. The winter ended, as winters do, because the world does not hold onto cold forever. The land greened up with the March rains, and the creek ran full and fast, and Cabe Torres found where a new calf had been born without announcement in the back of the south pasture, and brought the news to Peter with the particular satisfaction of a young man whose job has given him something good to report. In the spring of 1882, Clara told Peter she was expecting again. He received this news with somewhat more composure than the first time, though not significantly more, and she was pleased about this because it meant that the enormity of it had not been reduced by familiarity, that he was still a man who felt things fully and let her see it. This pregnancy was harder than the first. Through the summer months, Clara was more tired and more uncomfortable, and she reduced her hours at the school with a reluctance that Peter observed and respected, because he understood that her work was not merely a job but a vocation, something she would have chosen even if it had not been necessary, and the interruption of it cost her something real. He made adjustments around the house and the ranch to reduce the practical demands on her without making her feel managed, which was a balance that required more attention than almost anything else he did that summer, and he got it approximately right, which Clara acknowledged by saying, "You're doing very well at this," in a tone that suggested she knew exactly what he was doing and appreciated it more than she wanted to make him proud. Their second child was born in November 1882, a daughter they named Ruth Eleanor Haskins. Ruth for Peter's mother, who had been a quiet and steady presence in a household that had not always made room for such qualities. Eleanor for Clara's mother, whose love of books and learning had been the seed of everything Clara had built. Ruth Eleanor arrived with considerably more urgency than Franklin had, in a November storm that made the roads difficult and meant that Peter delivered his daughter himself with instructions from Margaret Hale delivered by Cabe Torres, who had ridden to town and back in the storm, and the whole proceeding was the most frightening and most extraordinary experience of Peter's life up to that point. Ruth was healthy. Clara was exhausted but well. Peter sat in the bedroom in the aftermath with his new daughter in his arms and his heart in approximately 30 places at once, and Franklin, who was 2.5 and had been kept in the kitchen by Cabe during the delivery, came in and looked at his sister with the serious evaluation of an elder sibling conducting an assessment. "Small," Franklin said. "She'll get bigger," Peter said. "Is she staying?" "She's staying," Peter said. Franklin considered this with his characteristic thoroughness, and then apparently accepted it, because he went back to the kitchen and asked Cabe if there was more biscuit, which there was. The years that followed were the years of building, in the full sense of a word that means not just construction but accumulation, the slow and patient addition of substance to a life. The cattle herd grew. The pasture fencing was extended and improved. A proper barn replaced the converted old structure, built by Silas Prout and 3 other men over a summer with Peter working alongside them, a solid building that would last decades. The house grew too. a new room added in the summer of 1883 to accommodate the children properly, and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides of the house, which became in the evenings the place where the Haskins family conducted the daily business of being a family, Franklin with his ever-increasing book of questions, and Ruth with the early evidence of a personality that combined her father's stubbornness with her mother's precision into something formidable. Clara taught through all of it, returning to the school after each child with the determination of a woman who has decided that her work and her family are not competing claims but complementary ones, and managing them both with the organizational intelligence that had always been one of her most formidable qualities. She was beloved by the town in the way that people who genuinely serve a community earn something beyond respect, something closer to permanence, as though the community has decided to make them part of its identity. The school board offered her the position of head teacher in 1883, when the board's own expansion made it clear they needed to formalize what had been happening informally for years. She accepted, and the small increase in salary went directly into the fund she had started keeping for the children's eventual education, because Clara Bishop Haskins believed in cycles of opportunity and intended to extend the one her mother had started. By the fall of 1884, Franklin was 4 years old and Ruth was nearly 2, and the Haskins place had 41 head of cattle and a reputation in the region for well-managed land and honest dealing. Peter had been offered a position on the county land board twice and had declined both times, not from disinterest in civic matters, but from a clear assessment of where his energy was most usefully applied, and the people who knew him understood this and respected it. He had a habit of speaking at town meetings when something mattered and being silent when it didn't, which meant that when Peter Haskins stood up in the community hall on any given evening, the room tended to pay attention. One such evening in September of 1884, the meeting was about the proposed route of a railroad spur that a Denver company had been suggesting for 2 years without committing to. And Peter stood up and said clearly that the proposed route would cut across 6 homestead properties in a way that displaced families who had legal title to their land, and that the community should not support a route that solved a commercial problem by creating a human one. He said it without accusation but with the clarity of someone who has thought it through, and the meeting voted against the proposed route by a margin that surprised the Denver company's representative who was present, and a new route was eventually agreed upon that caused no displacement. Clara, at home that evening after the children were in bed, said, "You were good tonight." "It needed saying," Peter said. "Most of what needs saying never gets said," she replied. "You say it. That matters." He looked at her across the kitchen table, the familiar geography of her face that he had been reading for 6 years and had not finished with, and thought that whatever combination of events and decisions and accumulated days had led to this particular evening in this particular kitchen with this particular person across from him, it had been exactly right, and he was grateful for all of it, including the parts that had been hard. The telegraph arrived in Redemption Creek in 1885, linking the town to the wider world with the immediacy that transformed the quality of information and the pace of decisions. The railroad spur, on its revised route, arrived in 1886, and with it, a new wave of settlers and commerce that changed the town significantly, adding a bank, a second general store, a proper hotel that eclipsed Margaret Hale's establishment without replacing it since Margaret retained her loyal clientele through the quality of her welcome, and a school addition that doubled Clara's capacity and required hiring a second teacher for the younger grades. The new teacher Clara hired was a young woman named Adeline Park, 22 years old and freshly certified from Denver, who arrived in Redemption Creek in the fall of 1886 with the same clear-eyed assessment of the place that Clara had shown 8 years earlier, and Clara received her with the generosity of someone who remembers what arriving somewhere new feels like and wants to make it easier for the next person. Adeline Park and Cabe Torres, who was now 27 and had been the Haskins ranch's steady right hand for 4 years, were introduced by Clara at a church social in October and proved to have a great deal to say to each other on the subject of the region's history, Cabe's family having been here longer than the town itself, and Adeline's scholarly interest in that history making for a conversation that lasted the entire evening, while Clara watched from across the room with the expression of Marguerite Flores multiplied by experience. Peter noticed Clara's expression and said, "You didn't." "I simply introduced them," Clara said, with perfect innocence. "Sure you did," he said. Cabe Torres and Adeline Park were married in the spring of 1887, and their wedding in the same church where Peter and Clara had been married 8 years earlier was attended by everyone who mattered in Redemption Creek, and the reception was at Margie's, and Cal Denton played the fiddle again with the ease of a man whose instrument is an old friend, and Peter danced with Clara in the same room where they had first danced together. And she was 32 years old and more beautiful to him than the day he had watched her step off the stage, which is the truest thing that can be said about a love that has grown with the people who carry it. Amos Wade died in the winter of 1887, peacefully in the bunkhouse at the Caldwell Ranch where he had spent 30 years, and Peter was told by Franklin Caldwell's son James, who had taken over management of the ranch when Franklin's health declined, and he sat for a long time after hearing it in the kitchen of his house with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him, feeling the particular weight of losing someone who had been a compass point. Amos had been at every significant thing. He had named the fear. He had been present when it mattered. He had made a rocking chair and left it without ceremony, and it was still on the porch, and Peter intended that it should stay there. Clara found him sitting with the cold coffee and sat down without asking and put her hand over his, and they sat together in the kitchen for a while in the way of people who understand that grief sometimes just needs company rather than resolution. "He knew what he was seeing," Peter said finally, "from the beginning, even when I didn't." "Good people have a sense for things," Clara said. "He was a good person." "The best," Peter said, and meant it in the specific way the word earns when it's applied to someone who has actually warranted it. He buried Amos Wade in the Redemption Creek Cemetery on a February morning with the whole Caldwell Ranch crew present and a good portion of the town, because Amos had been a presence longer than most, and his absence was going to register in ways that surprised people. Peter said a few words at the graveside that were not prepared, and were all the better for it, honest words about a man who had been honest, and then they all went back to their lives and carried Amos with them in the ways he had shaped them. Franklin Haskins was 7 in the summer of 1887, and Ruth was 4, and the house was full of the particular energy of children who are old enough to be people, and young enough to still be discovering what kind of people they are. Franklin had decided, with the thoroughness that characterized all his decisions, that he wanted to understand cattle, not just be around them but genuinely understand them, and he followed Peter around the pastures on weekends with the focused attention of an apprentice who is taking his apprenticeship seriously. Ruth, meanwhile, had decided that her primary interest was in how everything worked, and her questions were of the mechanical and causal variety that Clara fielded with the resources of her education and Peter handled with the resources of his experience, and together they managed to satisfy most of them. The school year of 1887 to 1888 was the one where Clara and Adeline together proposed a modest library expansion to the town council, a proper library building separate from the one room in the church, with funding from a combination of municipal budget and private donations. Clara had been planning the proposal for a year, and she made it with the precision of someone who has anticipated every objection and prepared every counter, and the council approved it 4-1, the one dissent being Holt, who had retained his suspicion of expenditures that did not immediately generate commercial return, but who was outvoted and accepted it with the grace of a man who respects a well-made argument even when he disagrees with its conclusion. The library opened in the spring of 1888, a small building of honest construction with room for 500 books and 4 reading tables, and a stove for winter. And Clara stood at the dedication with Ruth on her hip and Franklin beside her, and said a few words about what books had meant in her own life, and what she hoped they would mean in the life of the community. And Peter stood in the gathering on the spring afternoon and watched her speak with the clear-eyed confidence of a woman who knows what she is doing and why and what it is for, and felt the same thing he felt on the day she stepped off the stage, the same recognition but deeper now, seasoned by years, certain in the way that only time can make things certain. By 1890, the Haskins place had 53 head of cattle, 30 acres improved with good fencing and managed pasture rotation, a barn that was one of the best in the county, a house that had grown into something that people described as one of the finest homes in the region without being elaborate, and a family that was known throughout Redemption Creek and the surrounding country as the kind of family that made a community stronger simply by being in it. Franklin was 10 years old and helping with real ranch work on weekends and after school, learning the cattle with his father's patience and his mother's analytical precision. Ruth was 7 and had taken so strongly to reading that the house had acquired a second bookshelf in the parlor and was approaching the need for a third. The third child came in 1890, a boy they named Samuel Amos Haskins. The Amos was for the man who had known how to name the fear, and Peter said it aloud when he registered the name with the county clerk and felt the naming as a form of gratitude that carried further than words. Samuel Amos arrived in October and was, from the beginning, different from his siblings in the specific way that third children are shaped by the household that exists when they arrive, a household already rich with personality and routine and love accumulated over years. He was cheerful in a way that Franklin had never quite been, and Ruth was only sometimes, and he regarded the world with an openness that suggested he had arrived expecting it to be good and had found his expectation confirmed. Peter held his third child on the evening of his birth, sitting in the kitchen in the lamplight with Clara resting in the bedroom and Franklin and Ruth asleep, and he thought about the man he had been in 1874, 27 years old in a bunkhouse in eastern Colorado, putting half his wages in a lockbox without knowing why. And the distance between that man and this one was not measured in miles or years, but in the full specific weight of everything that had accumulated between then and now. The land, the house, the cattle, the marriage, the children, the losses, the winter nights, the spring mornings, the conversations at the kitchen table and on the porch and on horseback across the pasture, the whole living texture of a life built with the right person in the right place at the right time. He had been saving his pay for 4 years without knowing who he was saving it for, and the money had become land, and the land had become a home, and the home had become a life, and the life had become more than he had known how to imagine. He looked at Samuel Amos in his arms and thought that some things you build toward without knowing you're building. And when you arrive you understand that the not knowing was part of it, that the faith required to save without a reason was itself a preparation for the faith required to love without a guarantee, and that both of them had proven to be exactly worth it. Clara called from the bedroom, just his name, and he carried the baby in and sat beside her on the bed, and they looked at their youngest child in the October lamplight. And outside the Colorado night was still and clear, and the stars were the same stars that had been over the range on the night Amos Wade asked him if he was being cautious or scared, and the creek at the south edge of the property was running, and the cattle were quiet in the barn, and the house was everything it had been meant to be. "We should sleep," Clara said. "We should," Peter agreed, and neither of them moved for another few minutes because the moment was too good to end. And when they finally settled with the baby between them and the lamplight turned low, the last thing Peter heard before sleep was Clara's breathing evening out into the rhythm of rest, and it was the finest sound in the world. The years of the 1890s were years of deepening, the way all good things deepen when they are tended and given time. Franklin grew into a young man who combined his father's instincts about land with his mother's hunger for understanding, and at 14 was doing the work of a hand and reading books borrowed from the library on cattle breeding and range management with equal commitment. Ruth at 11 was writing with a precision that made Clara's teacher's heart accelerate every time she read her daughter's essays, and was already talking about going to school in Denver the way Clara had, with the certainty of someone who has identified a destination and is working toward it. Samuel grew into his cheerfulness with the thoroughness of a child who has found his natural quality and sees no reason to moderate it. He was the one who greeted visitors at the gate with an enthusiasm that made even the most reserved adults feel welcomed, and who brought home stray cats and injured birds with a regularity that tested the household's practical limits and expanded its heart. Cabe and Adeline Torres had 3 children of their own by 1892, and the families were close in the way that people become who share a community and a history and genuine affection, gathering for meals and holidays and the ordinary occasions of mutual life. Adeline had become a full partner with Clara in the school's work, and the 2 women were a formidable intellectual partnership that the community had come to regard as one of its best assets. The Caldwell Ranch passed to James Caldwell in 1891, when Franklin Sr.'s health finally gave way to age, and Peter attended the old rancher's funeral with the full weight of gratitude for a man who had been generous at the right moment, and who had made possible, through that generosity, a significant part of what the Haskins' life had become. James Caldwell kept the ranch going with his father's competence, if not quite his father's gift, and the professional relationships between the Caldwell operation and the Haskins place continued, Cabe Torres having expanded his work to include some work for the Caldwell Ranch as well, which suited everyone. Peter Haskins turned 43 in the fall of 1890, and he sat on the porch in the October evening in Amos Wade's rocking chair with Clara beside him and the children's, various sounds coming from inside the house, and looked out at the land in the last of the day's light, the pasture where the cattle moved at the south edge, the barn standing solid against the evening sky, the fence lines running out to the property boundaries that were his and his family's, and felt the full weight of the word enough, not as limitation but as completion, the specific satisfaction of a man who has built the thing he was building and is sitting inside it. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked, which was a question she asked when she could see him thinking and wanted to know if he wanted to share it. "I'm thinking about August 1878, he said. She smiled in the evening light. "The stage. The stage," he said. "And a carpetbag and a hat box and a woman who looked at this town like she was assessing whether it was worth her time." "It was worth my time," she said. "You decided that quickly," he said. "I decided it the moment a man held a door open and said something about redemption being under discussion," she said. "I knew something was beginning." He looked at her in the October evening, the face that was so familiar that it was part of the geography of his inner life now, as recognizable and necessary as the line of the mesa against the sky or the sound of the creek after rain. "So did I," he said. "I just needed a few more months to catch up." "You were efficient once you got there," she said, with the quality of amusement that had been one of the things he had loved first and loved still, that particular warmth at the corner of her eyes when she was pleased by something. He reached out and took her hand over the arm of the rocking chair, and she turned her hand to hold his, and they sat on the porch in the October evening in the life they had built together, and the stars came out one by one over the Colorado sky the way they always did, reliable and brilliant, the same stars above the same land, and everything that mattered was present, and everything that had been saved and waited for had been found. And the story of 4 years of paychecks in a lockbox had become the story of a life so full that the man who had started saving them could not have imagined its dimensions, and would not have traded a single hour of the building of it for anything the wide world had to offer. Inside the house, Samuel was laughing at something, the pure and unguarded laugh of a child who finds the world good, and Ruth said something in her precise way that evidently added to the joke, and Franklin's lower voice said something that made both younger siblings laugh again, and the sound of it came out through the kitchen window into the evening air on the Haskins place on the 30 acres 6 miles from Redemption Creek, Colorado, in the fall of the year, and it was everything.